Before Jared Murphy and his guests get into the discussion about gun control, just wanted to give you a little cheat sheet about some gun control measures. It's bearing arms by the book, a look at some of the laws that govern that Second Amendment. We're going to start first with right here in the United States. President Obama issued his executive order on guns to say that federal gun sellers must now, or all gun sellers must now be federally licensed and perform criminal background checks on anyone who wants to buy a gun. This closes what was seen as a loophole for people who are selling guns at trade shows or on a small level like a Craigslist person. Here in New York State, we're recognized as having some of the strictest gun laws in the nation. And the New York SAFE Act was signed into law by Governor Cuomo a month after the Sandy Hook massacre at the school. And among other things, it says that we got to create an assault weapons registry, limit the capacity of guns from 10 rounds down from 50, and requires background checks for ammunition. Now, bringing it more granular back to the New York City level, here, it's one of the most difficult places to register a handgun. Among all these things, you gotta have the 2 passport-sized photos, a social security card, and share any of your arrest records. You also have to pay a fee of about $429.79 to apply for that permit to have a gun for your personal protection, as well as a fingerprinting fee. Now, when we look at all of these things, we see the president making moves where there's gridlock, New York coming in very tough on guns, and New York City even harder to get a legal handgun. Now we're going to toss it to Derek and the discussion.
Brian, thanks for introducing some facts to a subject that sometimes gets pretty emotional, because the big story in the U.S. over the past year has been guns, thanks to mass killings at a church in Charleston, a military center in Chattanooga, an Oregon community college, and a California office building. And Brooklyn saw its own share of the bloodshed. A governor's aide gunned down in Flatbush, a rush-hour shooting at a subway station just 2 blocks from the studio. Now officials at every level are proposing new measures to reduce violence, from tighter federal gun laws to special courts for people busted packing heat. But what's driving the gunplay? What policies are likely to work? And what grassroots effort is underway here and now to stop the shooting before it starts? Joining me to discuss this are David Gaskin, Program Manager at S.O.S, Save Our Streets in Crown Heights. Welcome to BK Live.
Thank you.
Joe Herrera, the co-chair of the Coney Island Anti-Violence Collaborative. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And from the 45th District, we're delighted to have, for the first time on the show, City Council Member Jumaane Williams, who is also co-chair of the Gun Violence Task Force. Thanks for being here, Councilman.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with you. This is an issue where there's a lot of media attention, some of it sensational. There's a lot of politics, some of it responsible, some not. What is the reality of gun violence in Brooklyn now compared to recent years? What are the trends? Where are we headed?
So one, obviously, I think it's a pandemic across the country. At the same time, here in Brooklyn, New York City, we have to be clear that we're not in the same dangerous place we were in the 90s. That's just a simple fact of life. At the same time, we do have to continue the pressures because some of the same communities are still dealing with gun violence and people are dying. And I believe what we need to do is separate out, and always separate out when we're talking about this. One is a public health crisis, but 2, you need to talk about the supply of guns and the demand. And the supply comes in dealing with the gun control measures, many of them which were talked about. That's the supply and the flow of guns into our communities. Some of those measures work and some of them don't. Some are more for mass shootings and less about handgun violence, and some of them, like some of the measures that the president is trying to put in, would help with some of the handgun violence. But we have to also talk about the demand, because no matter how many guns are here, our young people don't have to pick them up. And I think that's where some of the work we did on the task force with some of the members led to the crisis management system, which now includes the other guests that I have here, to try to intersect so that we don't have that demand of violence. We can deal with the structural problems in those communities. And I believe if we don't talk about the 2 things at the same time, we're going to miss out on an opportunity to deal with some of the violence that our cities deal with every day.
Joe, let's talk about what you see in Coney Island, compared to the citywide picture. Violence is rising, violence is changing. What are you seeing in your neighborhood?
Well, Coney Island, we look at it as Brooklyn's playground, right? So in a part of Coney Island, you have rides and all this wonder happening. People from all over the world come to Coney Island to celebrate, and have a great time. And then you go 5-10 blocks down, and You have projects where one kid can't go 3 blocks to the basketball court because he has beef with a certain group of individuals over there. We were just recently celebrating the Coney Island Anti-Violence Collaborative. It's a coalition of community residents, nonprofit organizations, and other community stakeholders who come together to address gun violence. We were just having a celebration because of a couple of months we had no shootings in their area, and on that same evening, a young man, in his 30s, got shot just right outside his door. The mother of the children, 2 days later, died of a massive heart attack because she just couldn't take it. Now leaving 3 children without a family. Every time a gunshot happens, the perpetrators are thinking about the beef with that individual, but it causes this ripple effect across a whole community. And here in Coney Island, we have a grassroots community that's really just coming together and advocating to put an end to this. And we have general meetings every month where 50 to 100 residents come out and share best practices, talk about violence in the community, and just really try to come up with collective actions to address the violence that's happening.
David, in Crown Heights, what do you think drives the violence, gun violence or otherwise? Is it poverty? Is it violent media? Is it people's upbringing? What's behind it?
I believe it's a mix of all those things you just mentioned just now. Poverty, violent upbringing, just not having the proper resources to be able to deal with conflicts alone, let alone just violent shootings and killings. Most of the shootings and killings that we attend to in Save Our Streets, the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn, are interpersonal, whereas most of the people think it's all gang-related. It's not all gang-related. It's, something similar to what Joe just explained. This individual can't go across the street to this store because of the housing projects that's right there. More of interpersonal beefs.
And how do you deal with that? How does S.O.S. try to intervene and stop that before it becomes bloody?
Well, we just put our violence interrupters on the ground. Our violence interrupters are what you learned to be referred to as credible messengers. These are the men and the women who have similar histories and backgrounds of the population that we deal with. They come from these areas. Everyone knows them. They have a high level of respect. They are able to get into areas where, law enforcement can't get in, and other individuals cannot get in because they are not welcome. But these group of men and women, our violence interrupters, are welcome there. They're doing great work inside. They're changing minds, and they also changing behaviors as working with these high-risk individuals.
And that raises an interesting question. That's a grassroots approach to violence. Obviously, the conversation a few years ago was about the police approach to violence and stop and frisk and what was appropriate. In your work in the community and what you see of it, what is the appropriate role of police officers? How do they support work like the stuff you guys do?
I think law enforcement absolutely has a part to play. You can't do this without them. They're our partner. I think what we oftentimes lose sight of, they are only one of the partners. They are only one of the parts. Right. And too often in these communities, that is the only solution that is sent. And police officers can't solve all the problems in those communities. And if you do that, you're going to have a sense of over-policing, and the community is going to respond. And that's going to happen in any community with any human beings that are there. And so what we have to do is make sure that we allow police to do their job, enforcing. They are law enforcement. But you can't allow the public safety space to only be occupied by law enforcement because it's going to cause problems. And so that's where I believe New York City is leading in trying to change this discussion about what public safety is. Absolutely. Not just with the cure violence, but the crisis management system that it belongs to provides other structural issues. You provide legal services, there's jobs trainings, there's actually jobs for those areas, there's mediation services. We've actually learned, all studies show, the best way to prevent crime among young people is actually giving them a job. All the studies show that. 8-week job in the summer cuts violent crime arrests in half for 6 months after that. So one of the things I'm hoping that we can do in this budget is actually fund every child that wants a job to have one. We have 150,000 young people that apply for jobs. Our young people want to work. Only 50,000 of them get it. We have enough money to fund something like that.
So policing is a tool, and you're nodding in agreement with that. But I know that part of what you do in Coney Island is try to give young people their own tools for dealing with beefs or other disagreements more productively. So what do you say to somebody they're a teenager, they're angry, they feel threatened? How do you intervene in that and try to give them a better way out?
It's difficult, right? Because you grow up, a lot of these kids, they grow up in these communities. They don't really see the outside of the community. And there's this culture within the community where, even me growing up in South Brooklyn as a kid, there was very few ways to deal with a beef in the community. I mean, you're either going to fight or you draw a line in the sand and say, don't cross that line, because if I catch you, that's the tools that our young people are working with in these communities. So it's not that a lot of times the people think they're just you're prone towards violence, but really it's about teaching them how to resolve conflicts in a different way. There's multiple factors that go into why someone would grab a gun and go and shoot another individual in their community. We need to take a multifaceted approach and make sure that we're providing job help, that we're providing mediation, conflict resolution workshops, and in addition to helping police do some community policing to put a stop or proactively put a stop to this. But it's very important to have a cure violence, people on the ground that these young people trust. And because that's where it comes to. Right now, and so unfortunately in our communities, the young people, they don't trust the police. Mm-hmm. So if they have a problem, they're not going to get on that phone and call 911. They're going to go and they're going to grab a gun and they're going to deal with it themselves. So who can we get in these communities that can speak to these young people that they trust, people that be mentors, people that would really say, hey, you know what, there's another way to address these issues and this is how you go about it. Sometimes just giving these young people tools and other than a gun is just the way to go about addressing gun violence.
Part of the conversation over the past year as alarm over gun violence has increased in the city is not just about prevention, but also punishment. The idea that if you make it clear that if you're caught with a gun, you'll go to jail. Setting up now, we're talking about a new court system or a separate court part to deal with gun violence. And I wonder, for the young people you work with, David, are they thinking about those kind of consequences? Do you think if you increase prison sentences that someone is less likely to resort to violence? Does that enter into their calculation, do you think?
Well, the population that I deal with, yes, they are aware. They are aware because you have workers that's making them aware. So we're making them aware of the effects of gun violence in their communities. We're also making them, on the lower level, shootings and killings, we're also making them aware of the effects of gun violence on the community when it comes to the laws now. So in 2003, it was stated that, the same courts came about, but they had failed. They're going to interject and have the courts in now, 2 new gun courts, and I guess we're going to see how it works. But
what do you think, Councilman?
I think it's important to hear what he said. He said they are aware because the workers are telling them. And so the fact of the matter is that there hasn't been a connection between the longer sentences and actually changing behavior. And that's what we want to do. To be clear, nothing that I'm saying or we're saying means that people should not be held accountable for their actions. Right. They have to be held accountable for their actions. There's no way around it.
And what do you think of the gun court idea as a vehicle for doing that?
So my issue with that is that we have to do more than law enforcement, again. And again, just law enforcement, just tough sentences do not change behavior. There has been some studies that's showing that swifter action as opposed to longer action does change behavior. But we have a tendency to overdo it, particularly when it comes to young black and brown men, without changing the circumstances in which those communities live in. And so my thing has always been, if you're going to do one, you have to do the other. So I don't have an issue with the gun courts in theory. I do have an issue with knowing that just focusing on those will not change behavior. We do have to keep people accountable, but we want to make sure that what we're doing is preventing people from doing the same action. If we're not doing that, then we're not getting to the point. And I wanted to make clear that gun violence has actually gone down and hasn't gone up. There has been a lot of media attention, which there should be. Even if you go to one gun violence victim, that victim doesn't care about statistics. But we have to make sure that we don't have this sky is falling mentality, because it isn't. We're actually doing a pretty good job on it. Murders did rise very slightly. There are ebbs and flows of crime has been. You could have looked at any point, even during the Bloomberg years, and we would have seen things go up. So we want to make sure that we are doing better and proper policing, also providing the structural changes to the deficits in these communities at the same time.
What do you think of the mayor's performance on this issue? That, as the councilman mentioned, that's been the topic of a lot of discussion in the newspapers and the press in terms of policy and in terms of talking about gun violence. Do you think he is taking it seriously enough?
Well, we have numerous programs in Coney Island who have come to Coney Island because of the mayor's initiative to reduce gun violence. So again, we have the Legal Aid Society, Momentum, who comes in and does conflict resolution workshops, mental health programs, and we together as well, have put together a number of different programs and workshops to address gun violence in the community. So I think that some of those wraparound services and some of the are happening because of the mayor's initiative. Again, I agree with the councilman. I think that really we have to hold these young people accountable, but again, you have to ask yourself, if a 13-year-old is committing murder, and this is more frequent than, on average, you have young people walking around with their friends memorialized on their T-shirts more than college graduates. Right. I mean, it's something happening in these communities, and punishing people is not going to put a stop to it, right? So we need to go in and find out really, what for a kid that grows up in a single-parent home, who's out at midnight, who's not attending school at 12, 13 years old, who's selling drugs, who's that kid is lost. And how do we develop supports? How do we input supports into this community to help those children to really stop? Because when a 13-year-old pulls that trigger, that's 2 lives that are gone. That's
definitely, and I think we talked about the city. Obviously, we exist in a broader context. Brian mentioned that we have some of the toughest gun laws in the country. In New York, we still have a serious handgun violence issue. Right. So, the discussion since San Bernardino and since Newton about tougher federal gun laws, would they make a difference here? Do you think?
So one, we do have some of the toughest gun laws, and I think the effects are shown if you compare to other cities. Although we have gun violence issues, we're doing much better than many of the other cities, so we have to take account for that. Your last question, how the mayor is doing, I believe that we are doing a lot better on this issue, and particularly in changing the conversation that I hope people are following across the nation. But we do have a lot more left to do. What I want to see is a Office of Gun Violence, and my colleagues have been pushing that, Councilman McCumbo. We need to see, as well as myself, we need to see the same response we see in Legionnaires and Ebola, with multiple agents coming out. Right. For some reason, when it's gun violence, we only see one agency. And we definitely have to change that. I think the changes in the gun laws will absolutely help. Some of them are more for the mass shootings and high-capacity shootings, which are less of what we see, and some of them will help with the handgun violence that we're seeing in this. So yes, I think the answer will help. I think we can do it without affecting Second Amendment, but we can't do it without discussing the demand side. And oftentimes, that is left out of the conversation. We focus only on gun control. The other big issue I think that will help in the federal government is that the Republicans, and it's really just them this time, blocking funding for even research on gun violence. They won't even allow the Center for Disease Control to research what's driving the gun violence and providing support for it. We kill more people in this country gun violence than almost anything else. 30,000 people die of gun violence. Same amount with automobiles. We spend millions and millions and millions, I think $500-something million on automobile deaths, about $5 million on guns. That's a problem. And so something like that, I think, will have a great trickle-down effect on gun violence across the country.
We've been talking about restricting access to guns for years. Lightning round question. Is there any hope, given the political climate in our country, of stronger federal gun control, do you think?
For the first time, yes, but it's not going to be easy.
What do you guys think? Any hope of that, or are we on our own?
I'm hoping that it would definitely move forward and it works out in everybody's favor.
Yeah, I think there's always hope, but I think that we have to hold our leaders accountable and don't become desensitized to this and say, oh, well, there's another shooting. We got to put pressure on government and hold our elected officials accountable to pass great, good gun reform.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for your good discussion and all your good work on this issue.
Thank you.